And I want to say thank you to Claudia. We're really fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from someone whose work has been so influential in getting prevention of violence against women on the international agenda, both within and internally to WHO and more broadly. And we're really indebted to you in a lot of the work that we're doing. So I'm going to speak today about our national framework for primary prevention of violence against women and their children and the evidence behind it. So this is work primarily in the Australian context. First, I just want to touch briefly on the work of our watch and give you a sense of who we are and what we do. So we're relatively young. We were established only in 2013 with funding from the Victorian and Commonwealth governments. Since then, most other states and territories have joined us as members, and our purpose is national leadership on the primary prevention of violence against women and their children. And in that, we work through what we call as a backbone organisation, a term sort of coined by Mary for the work that the organisation does. And many of you will be familiar with that term if you're familiar with collective impact style approaches. It basically means that we don't aim to do everything that needs to be done in the primary prevention of violence against women. Obviously we couldn't, no one could, but we do aim to sort of pull that work together, to build a shared understanding of what does need to be done and how, based on evidence, and to support all the different players that need to be in their different roles to that end. But it's on one particular area of work, which is our work influencing public policy systems and institutions, that I want to talk about today, because that work includes the development of evidence-based frameworks to build those shared understandings and guide practice. So Change the Story is the name of our national framework. As you can see, it's a shared framework for the primary prevention of violence against women and their children, and as far as we know, it's a world first as one of these sort of shared national roadmaps. We call it shared because it arose from the commitment of all Australian governments. This was a commitment made through our national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. And for those from overseas, you'll be aware that Australia is a federation, so the national plan is not a plan only of our federal or Commonwealth government. It's actually a plan that's been confirmed through the Council of Australian Governments, and therefore is a shared commitment of all state territory governments and the federal government, all 9 of them. And it has that sort of cross-jurisdictional support as a result. Importantly, though, it's also not our Watch's framework. We developed it in partnership with 2 other major organisations. One is our national research body, Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, and the second is Vic Health, and many of you will be familiar with the work of Vic Health because it's such a leader in public health and health promotion. And finally, it's a shared framework because we developed it with input from over 400 stakeholders across the country. So we basically did an evidence review and pulled together the research and took it on a roadshow across all the states and territories, and our stakeholders from government, non-government sectors and the private sector to look at that research and help us craft a way of framing the evidence and a way of determining what that meant in terms of national action. So before we look in more detail at Change the Story, just a quick note on scope and terminology. We take our definition of violence against women from the UN Declaration, and it's written up there on the slide, so I won't read it, but basically it covers any form of violence, physical, sexual, psychological, and the threat of it, whether happening in private or public. And it doesn't mention who would need to perpetrate it, where it would need to happen. It's a very inclusive definition. We also include children in recognition of the impacts that violence has, as Claudia explained, witnessing violence against their mothers or being exposed to violence against their mothers or female caregivers has on children. But importantly, the use of languages and their children, that comes similarly from our national plan that I just mentioned, and that means we're looking at the impacts on children of violence in the context of say, domestic, intimate partner and family violence. We're not looking at a primary prevention model for direct child abuse in itself. And that's because we're recognising that need, that has a whole different set of drivers and risk factors that would need to be taken into account, and prevention strategies. But of course, we're recognising that those are very overlapping issues, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, just a little bit more about what's in and what's out, because this can cause a lot of confusion. A lot of policy in this area, particularly in the Australian context, deals with family violence or domestic violence or other terms like that. These obviously overlap a great deal with this notion of violence against women, but they're not the same thing. So to take the example in Victoria, family violence is defined in legislation, and it covers most forms of violence that take place in the family context, regardless of the sex of the victim. So while the bulk of this violence is male intimate partner violence against women, hence the huge overlap in these circles, there are obviously other forms of violence that fall outside the scope of the violence against women rubric, such as elder abuse or adolescent violence against parents, and of course violence against men, whether that's perpetrated by men or women in the family context. So violence against women is at once a broader and a narrower term than something like violence against women, than something like family violence or domestic violence, but it's obviously more specific as to the sex of the victim. So male intimate partner violence, again, is one of the most common forms of this violence, if not the most common form, but the term violence against women also includes other forms of violence happening against women outside the family context, and most notably these are non-partner sexual assault. So international frameworks and organisations do tend to use this definition of violence against women, recognising that violence affects women and men differently, and the forms of violence that women experience have common characteristics and drivers, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And so this is the conceptualisation that's reflected in Change the Story and in the National Plan. And the reason I bring that up is because often when we get into conversations about, say, the relevance of Change the Story to some of, say, the policy work that's happening in Victoria on primary prevention of family violence, it can lead to confusion around but what about violence in same-sex relationships against men, but what about elder abuse and so forth. So I'm just trying to clarify where we're coming from and where the evidence base that we're drawing upon is coming from. Okay. So what does Change the Story tell us? The first element, if you like, or section of Change the Story is an explanatory model for violence. It draws together the international evidence on what's driving it and how we think those factors interact. And I'm going to spend most of the presentation really on this area because as my colleague and the co-author of the framer, Emma Partridge, put it, how you define the problem really sets up how you're going to approach it and how you're going to try and solve it. Everything else tends to fall out of that. So I'll talk mostly about that sort of framing and that evidence, and I know that the other speakers today are going to talk more about strategies and prevention practice that can fall out of this sort of framing. So first of all, while what we're interested in is violence against women, it's important to note that violence per se is actually a gendered phenomenon. Claudia touched on this, that in terms of victimisation, we know that men are more likely to experience violence from other men and more likely to experience that violence in public places. Women are more likely to experience violence from men as well, but from men they know, often in the home. And that women are also far more likely to experience sexual violence. And in terms of that impact, when we're talking about partner violence in particular, that impact has been found to be much more severe for women, and there's often more repeated violence, high levels of hospitalisation and murder, and high levels of fear. None of that negates the experience of partner violence against men or even against children. All violence is wrong. All violence has a terrible impact on its victims. But it's just to demonstrate, I suppose, these different dynamics that seem to be existing and the need for us to sort of look at how we address those. So very importantly, I think one of the major distinctions we need to deal with is this perpetration figure. Our national survey, the Personal Safety Survey, shows us that 95% of victims of violence, whether they're men or women, those victims, say they've experienced violence from a male perpetrator. So that's an incredibly skewed statistic on gender grounds, and there's obviously some sort of association there with the way we're constructing masculinity or the way we're expecting men to behave. Needless to say, we worked in developing this framework from the assumption that there was nothing inevitable about any of this, either the nature of violence or indeed violence itself. So Claudia just pulled out some extraordinary statistics about the differential levels of violence against women, prevalence levels of violence against women between different countries. And I think that 12-month prevalence differential of, I think, 3 to 30%, you said, it speaks volumes. It tells you that this is highly variable from social context or political context to social political context. There is nothing that says it's just something that happens, it's just something we need to deal with. We know it can be changed. We're also assuming, and I hope this is uncontroversial, that biology is not destiny in this. So we're not buying into, despite that 95% figure, it's not 95% of all men, and we're not buying into any arguments that men are naturally violent, and indeed there's a great deal of evidence to the contrary. And there's some pictures of some wonderful men, including for our Canadian colleagues, Justin, I thought we'd bring in. So there are these great examples of men who challenge violence and the sort of sexism and inequalities that can drive it every day. So of course it's not all men. Some of you may be familiar with that hashtag. It's sort of brought out every time in the media or elsewhere someone challenges male violence against women. Of course it's not, but that cry in itself sort of misses the point. Why does it miss the point? Because what we need to determine if we are to take a primary prevention approach that is informed by a public health model is what factors lead to a situation where more men choose to perpetrate violence against women at a population level. So if we know that, from what Claudia said, that ratio of men who perpetrate violence against women compared to men who do not perpetrate violence against women, if that ratio varies from country to country quite wildly, then what is it that makes the difference? So firstly, at that broad social level, the international evidence is now very well established that gender inequality, in a broad societal sense, has a very strong influence on levels of violence against women within that society. It's a correlation that's been observed for decades on things like gender equality indexes and prevalence data, but there's always been these sort of question marks as to whether there were also other factors playing in there, such as level of education or socioeconomic development. There was a really important study published in 2015 in The Lancet by Laurie Heiser and some other authors that put rest to such doubts to a certain extent. It was a multivariate analysis, so they covered a broad range of macro-level factors. And what they found is that it was factors relating to gender inequality, and in particular discriminatory laws and a range of sort of social beliefs or norms around gender and violence, that were among the most significant macro-level predicators for violence against women. And note what I just said about social norms regarding gender and violence. We're not just talking about gender equality in parliaments or women on boards, that sort of thing, those structural factors. We're also talking about the ways in which societies collectively construct gender and the notions of how men and women should behave through their beliefs. So in that Lancet study, factors like socioeconomic development, levels of socioeconomic development at the societal level, was found unlikely to have any causal relationship at all to violence against women. And other factors, especially education, were found to have a less significant influence. And education had a variable one depending on its interaction with gendered norms and power imbalances and the rates at which those were changing, which was fascinating, and more on that in a minute. But put simply, gender inequality is to violence against women what smoking is to lung cancer, it's what carbon emissions are to climate change. It's the biggest factor. It's not everyone likes it, not everyone really wants to act on that basis, but we have an overwhelming weight of evidence telling us that if we don't deal with this, we won't solve the problem that is violence against women. And that influence that exists at the social level, of course, filters down to the individual level. And can influence individual behaviour. So Vic Health carries out a survey here in Australia called the National Community Attitude Survey on Violence Against Women, and they found that those who hold stereotyping and discriminatory attitudes were more likely to condone violence against women. That's women and men who hold those attitudes are also more likely to condone violence against women. And other studies have found that men who hold such attitudes are more likely to perpetrate violence against women. There's a video on the Vic Health website that I won't play now, but it's a good one if you want to have a look. And we wouldn't be a proper public health presentation without bringing out the socio-ecological model again. You'll all be familiar with it as public health professionals, and Claudia has just used a version of it. I wish I had global in there as well, but it is for our national framework, so we'll take that. So we drew on that model when we were developing the framework to try and understand and explain how these factors such as gender inequality were maintained and reinforced through various structures, norms and practices that exist at these different levels of the social ecology. We also, importantly, take care to conceptualise gender inequality intersectionally. That is, it never exists in a vacuum. It intersects with other forms of entrenched inequality that can arise from colonisation, racism, ableism and heteronormativity, to name a few. So, as an example, a Muslim woman who's attacked for wearing the headscarf is experiencing a form of violence that's sexist, it's Islamophobic, it's potentially racist, and it's all at once. You can't break it down neatly into, oh, well, that violence derived from gender inequality or race or Islamophobia. So gender inequality can mean a lot of different things, and it intersects with a range of other factors in ways that are inseparable. It's also likely to mean different things in different countries and in different communities within a country. And to add to the complexity, when we were pulling together this research and developing the framework, we were also aware of significant research on factors that Claudia pointed out, like childhood experience of violence and the impact of that on future perpetration or victimisation, and things like alcohol abuse and violence and other drug abuse. And we wanted to know, there are a range of these factors, we wanted to know how they fitted into the picture as well. So we dug a bit deeper and looked not only at which factors were the strongest, but how they might be interacting. How am I going for time, Patty? Am I all right? Okay. So this is what we found. The factors that most consistently and significantly predicted higher levels of violence against women are here on the left, sorry, behind me. They were indeed gendered, but they pointed to particular expressions of gender inequality as having the greatest influence on violence against women. So as I said, it's not necessarily putting more women on boards and suddenly you're going to prevent violence against women. It's more complicated than that. The first of those, and probably the most obvious, is that tip of the iceberg. It's the condoning of violence against women. If your society at all levels, down from the societal to the individual, justifies, trivialises, excuses violence against women, blames the victim and so forth, then you will have higher levels of violence against women. That's fairly understandable. But what's perhaps less understandable is these other factors that lie underneath the condoning of violence against women and have just as significant a correlation in the research. One of these is, or the second of these is rather, men's control of decision-making and limits to women's independence. And this is true not just in private life, where it makes sense in terms of controlling behaviours and intimate partner violence, but also in public life. If your society, your community, your organisation is putting more men in decision-making positions and limiting women's independence, then those societies too, you will have higher levels of violence against women. Rigid gender roles and stereotype constructions of masculinity and femininity are in there as well. Most obviously, beliefs that, for example, men should be dominant and in control, or that men, even worse, meant that men should be aggressive and violent. And finally, male peer relations that emphasise aggression and disrespect for women. So obviously this is not all male peer relations. Male peer relations and friendships are a very positive thing, but those which set up cultures that are exclusive of women, that define themselves that to be in opposition to women, whether they're overtly hostile or whether they do that through the sexual objectification of women, are particularly problematic. And these are sort of peer cultures where to be a real man or to be welcome among the group, you have to display similar attitudes or at the very least sort of keep quiet about them. So they're not great peer cultures for any men who believe in equality and respect either, but they're particularly bad for women because they are associated with higher levels of violence against them. Now, there are a number of other factors still on this same slide, which are over there on the right, that were found to be significant as well, but in different ways, not in as consistent a way. So the evidence on them is a little more equivocal. That is, they had a significant impact in some studies, but no or little impact in others, or they seem to have an impact only in association with the gender drivers. And in summary, these were the condoning of violence in general. So this is not just violence against women, but community violence more broadly. Same justifying, minimising, excusing stuff as for violence against women, though. The experience of or exposure to violence, especially as a child, but also through war and conflict or other circumstances. The weakening of pro-social norms, and in that especially the harmful use of alcohol, and we could put other drugs in that category as well. 4 is socioeconomic inequality and discrimination, and 5, backlash factors, what we've decided to call backlash factors, which is where you see increases in violence against women when male dominance or status is challenged in some way. So all of these things are significant, and they definitely can't be ignored. But what we're saying in Change the Story is you can't just look at them in isolation. The evidence is quite clear on that they don't operate just in isolation. You need to consider them in the context of the gendered drivers. For example, with regards to socioeconomic inequality and also backlash factors, male unemployment studies, so studies which show men who have fewer economic and social resources relative to their partners or are put into this situation suddenly, have been shown to be more likely to perpetrate violence against women. But this, if you correlate this against, or if you contrast this against the gendered attitudes that we talked about a moment ago, that is those that are more likely to perpetrate, who increase their violence or for whom the violence becomes more severe, is almost uniquely those who already hold stereotypical beliefs about their roles as breadwinners or providers. So men with fewer resources than their partners or who become unemployed, who hold more egalitarian beliefs about gender roles, don't have any greater risk of perpetrating violence. Similarly, alcohol interacts most dangerously when you've got these male-peer relations that emphasise aggression and disrespect towards women, and when you have these stereotyped constructions of masculinity, which can lead to drinking cultures that emphasise this idea of male conquest and aggression. And where men are provided with a sort of excuse for certain behaviours under the influence of alcohol. So that is, it's the interaction between those social norms relating to alcohol and the social norms relating to gender that can increase the likelihood, the frequency and the severity of violence against women, not just the consumption of alcohol itself. Okay, I'm going to flick through a little bit faster. That's just another thing to say that macro-level predicators are not destiny. We see a range, obviously, of attitudes and behaviours across the population. And some groups of people are impacted by more factors more frequently. Everyone's dealing with intersecting forms of inequality, and life experiences have an impact. So all of this means that you see these differences in the population, and the work of prevention, if you like, is to try and build a society where we increase the percentage at this, what side am I on there? This left-hand side, those that are sort of doing well, that hold these respectful attitudes, that know what a healthy and equal relationship is, and decrease the ones that are at that risk of perpetrating violence end. And Change the Story outlines a suite, basically, of essential and supporting actions that directly align to the drivers and reinforcing factors that I just identified, and based still on that population model, our hypothesis, if you like, at the national level, because very little of this has been tried at the national level in a comprehensive way, is that if you put into place a suite of actions across multiple settings and with multiple stakeholders, you will lower the probability of violence against women. All right. I have the video. Have I got time to play the video? All right. And Jane, what do I do? Someone else is doing it. Okay.
This is the story of a boy and a girl. It's a universal story and an Australian story. It's a story that occurs every 2 minutes, in fact. A story that happens 657 times a day, every day of the year, and in every kind of household and every city and region across Australia. This is the biggest story behind violence against women. This story doesn't have a happy ending, because this is the story of how gender inequality contributes to the murder of one Australian woman almost every week. Sounds like a tall tale, right? Let's take things back to the start. Here's the story of a regular woman. As a girl, she gets told how pretty she is, never how clever she is, that if she wears a short dress, she's asking for it, that proper girls don't play football, and there's no girls' footy team at school anyway. She grows up and gets used to being harassed by men on the street. That's just the way it is. Here's the story of a regular man. As a boy, he learns that women aren't equal to men from a very early age. Even though both his parents work, on the weekends his mum does the housework while Dad watches sport. When he cries about being bullied at school, his dad tells him to stop being such a girl and just punch him right back. Technically speaking, we'd say that these social norms, practices and structures have shaped both the boy and the girl, creating a society where women are valued less and men are expected to be dominant and in control. In such a world, disrespect and hostility is excused and violence against women is far more likely. But back to our story. The girl grows up into a woman, the boy grows into a man, and they begin to date. He jokes that he hopes she doesn't get fat now that we're together. She's not sure whether she should laugh. They have the same education and do similar work, yet he earns more money. He's quickly promoted, like other men in the company, while she gets overlooked. At home, she does all the household chores, and he takes control of their joint finances, seeing as he's the main breadwinner and all. When they're at the pub, he puts her down in front of his mates. His friends stay quiet. In the morning, he wakes up and blames the alcohol. And stress, he always has an excuse. When she gets pregnant, her boss says she can't come back part-time. After the baby is born, the lack of flexible job opportunities and childcare keeps her out of the workforce. She is socially isolated and financially dependent on him. He controls decision-making, and her. They are not equals. She is dependent on him for everything. So she never tells anyone that he has started to hit her. She doesn't say anything to her family or friends. She grows more isolated. She has nothing else but him, so she lives with the violence until their story ends, one way or another. This story isn't a one-off. It's a story shared by 1 in 4 Australian women who have experienced physical or sexual violence from a current or former partner. And it's a story of 1 in 5 women since the age of 15 who experience sexual violence, including rape, 1 in 4 emotional violence, and 1 in 3 women physical violence. But it's also a story that affects children. More than half of the women who experienced violence had children in their care when the violence occurred. For victims and perpetrators, violence against women is the conclusion often reached after a life lived in a society where women and men aren't treated equally. But we, you and I, can change the narrative. Better education, policies, practices, support and funding can prevent this all too common story. When women and men have equal power, value, and opportunities in relationships and in society, violence against women is less likely. By nurturing caring, respectful, and equal relationships, and by creating equitable and inclusive communities, workplaces, and institutions, we can create a society of equality and respect, where violence against women is unthinkable. Let's change the story, because ending violence against women starts with gender equality.
Okay. Oh, it's just, I've got to wrap up. I've got 1 more minute. Oh, yeah. I know. So yeah, just to wrap up. The other sections of Change the Story, I've concentrated mostly on elements 1 or 2. There are another series of elements that outline an approach, element 3, how to implement the actions. And in that we've talked, it's very public health 101, employ effective techniques and approaches such as direct participation programs, community mobilisation, organisational development, communications activities that are integrated with the above, and of course civil society advocacy. Do that in a way that aims to reach everyone, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second, and do it in a coordinated, multifaceted and long-term way that is evidence-based and evidence-building. I think Emma will probably touch on some of the measurement issues with prevention of violence against women and what's been evaluated and what hasn't. Basically, we really are in an evidence-building stage for this work in terms of what does work and what actually has an impact, particularly on future perpetration and victimisation, because in order to work that out, you need quite expensive sort of longitudinal studies. So it's really important that we don't use that as an excuse not to act, but rather build the evidence as we go. All right, I've got the stop from Patty. So I won't touch on the rest, but please, if you do want any further information on what is in Change the Story, it's available on our website. It covers some of the things I've just flicked through there. And also on our website is more information on the ways in which our watch is hoping to support this multifaceted and integrated approach and some of the other resources we're looking at developing. So thank you very much.